OCO, hello everyone. Welcome to Speaking Our Truth, podcast for change by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I am your host, Leanne Pippin, and I'm a member of Cherokee Nation. Before we get started, let's hear a quick word from NIWRC.
The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center offers culturally grounded resources and materials to support tribal domestic violence programs and grassroots advocates. Learn more at niwrc.org/resources.
I want to introduce our guest host for this mini-series, Heather Brugel.
Heather is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin
and first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. She is a policy specialist here at NIWRC. Heather is a historian and frequent lecturer whose research includes topics such as American history, colonization, indigeneity, the history of American boarding schools, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. She is currently a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, in the First Nations Education ED doctoral program.
Hi, my name is Heather Brugel, and I am the policy specialist with NIWRC. Welcome to Families Taking Action in the Face of MMIW, Episode 4. This series sheds light on the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We are releasing an episode each day as part of the National Week of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. The brave families in this podcast will share their stories and experiences with their loved ones who have gone missing or murdered. Please listen with care, knowing that the subject matter can be triggering and take space when you need. In October of 1987, Daisy Mae Heath, a member of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, was reported missing. Daisy was an avid outdoors person. She was a basketball player and had a natural talent for sports. She often traveled between White Swan on the Yakama Reservation and the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon. The last time her family saw her was in late August of 1987. She was 29 years old. She was reported missing on October 29, 1987. Some of her personal belongings were found in a very remote area of the Yakama Reservation known as Soda Springs. This area is closed to non-tribal citizens. The FBI described her disappearance as a suspected homicide. I'd like to introduce you to our guest today, Patsy Whitefoot. Patsy is a citizen of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. She's an educator, an activist, and continuously lends her voice to the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis in Washington state and nationally. Patsy has served in education and has served on the Yakama Tribal Council. She is retired, but continues to work and live in White Swan, where strong tribal roots continue. Patsy is also the co-host for the War Cry podcast, which discusses issues and historical connections about missing and murdered Indigenous women, men, and LGBTQ2S community members. For 30 years, Patsy has served as the education chair of the Affiliated Tribes of the Northwest Indians. Her vision for health of her people is steeped in her ancestral knowledge of Indigenous languages, cultures, and histories, and tied to the rich landscapes. Thank you for joining us today, Patsy. I appreciate your time and your knowledge. When a loved one goes missing, there can be a million different things going through your mind, and it can be hard to focus. What are some first things that families should do when they realized that a loved one is missing?
To begin with, Heather, I just want to say greetings to everyone in my language. Shikpachwe, Inknashwinik Shestwapik, Ku Pashtunwiki, Patricia Whitefoot, Kutlaninam Ashanisha, the National Indian Women's Resource Center. So I just greeted you all in my language of the Yakama Nation people. It's the language that is shared amongst the plateau tribes here in the Northwest that include not only the Yakama Nation, of which I'm a citizen of, but also the Warm Springs tribe in Oregon, the Umatilla in Oregon, the Nez Perce in Idaho. And so as plateau tribes, it's important, to recognize our ancestors and also the languages and culture that we share amongst our families. And in the case of my sister, Daisy Mae Heath, she was a citizen of the Yakama Nation, but she was also a descendant from the Warm Springs tribe in Oregon. Her father was from Warm Springs, Eldred Heath, and her mother was Nancy Whitefoot of the Yakama Reservation. Just taking all that into context, that, you know, the family members that we speak of also have a history. And so I want to acknowledge their history and their place in the lives of our families. So definitely there's a lot that goes through your mind when you finally come to the realization that perhaps your loved one is missing. And in the case of Daisy, my sister contacted me. She lives also in the community of White Swan and said, don't you think we should report her missing? Because we had called family members in Warm Springs and, you know, other locations around the Northwest where she would possibly be, including her friends on the Yakama Reservation. And during that time, we also were getting word back from various individuals, family members, friends who said that they saw her in such and such a place, say, for instance, along the Columbia River, which is about 3 hours away from where we live on the vast Northwest area, or they saw her in another location. And so, of course, when you hear that, you begin to have hope. But at the same time, because in our area on the Yakama Reservation, we also had several women who had gone missing or who had been murdered in the area. And in the community of White Swan, it's a very remote, rural, and isolated community. It's not an incorporated community, and we do have a very significant Native population there. And so basically, you're even, communicating with one another by phone or by talking directly with somebody. And so that is also something that needs to be considered is the communication that goes on in the state of Washington, where the Yakama Reservation is. We have a very large reservation of 1.4 million acres. And so it's very vast, plus our original territories. And so wherever our territories are, that's where our family members gather or travel to gather our foods and our medicines. And that's what my sister did. So you have to take all of that into account about thinking where she might be. Plus, she also played basketball and softball. And so it wasn't unusual for her to travel. She loved sports. And she, as a matter of fact, was an all-star player, most valuable player, in what she did. And so she was very independent. In this case, she lived with me. And so there was just that pattern that we became used to, her traveling. And so to me, that's what she was doing. But when my sister called me and says, don't you think we better call and report her missing? Because she lived with me, I think I really took it very hard and very personal. And when you begin to consider that, in my case, I wasn't necessarily considering that because to me, she was always going to be there. And it wasn't until my sister called later, she went and made the report, but she called to say that, well, the police are going to come see you. And I had a lot of fear. I didn't realize it, but because of what happened when the detective arrived at my place, I think I was in a state of shock because just his presence at the front door just sent anxiety through me, stress and anger all at the same time. In that case, when the detective did arrive, I didn't know what to do. I just got angry and I just ended up slamming the door on him and didn't really talk to him. And then he went back and talked to my sister, and she got kind of upset with me because I didn't talk with him. And it wasn't till later that I was able to do that. But in my case, then after that occurred, I just kind of went into a deep depression after that for, several days. As I look back at that time, I think that if family members are going to do that, I think it's going to be important to make certain that you have another adult, a trusted adult to be with you, either, a family member or, a close friend that you trust. I think that would have helped me, but I was by myself with my children. I felt like the world just fell out from underneath my feet. I end up just going into the bedroom and just falling asleep. I didn't realize afterwards my oldest son came in, and he was about middle school then. He came into the room, and after several days, he just, kind of admonished me and said, "Mom, you're our mother. You have to get up now, and you have to keep moving forward, and you have to keep living," and kind of shouted at me about what I needed to do. And at that point in time, I didn't realize that's what I needed to do because I was so numb. Him taking that role and telling me what I needed to do. And I think at that point in time, that's something I needed to hear, that I have children. You need to take care of us. You need to get up now, and you need to go on with your life. And that's where a trusted friend or family member would be very helpful for family members, because when you first begin to somewhat accept it, it's really hard. And then to have a detective show up at your door, it's like affirming that yes, this is true. But how you're approached by law enforcement isn't always, in a very done in a very sensitive manner and appropriate manner, because what they're coming to do is they're coming to tell you or say, we're going to take this report. And I don't think it's helpful when you have law enforcement that does that. And so I just think that there's more training needed as well with law enforcement. And this is something that we've been, as family members, we have been advocating. I had thought, it might have been helpful to have somebody there, spiritual support to, help you through this process. And I later realized I should have been recording all the communication with any officials that was talking to me, because over the years, that's something I didn't know to do. So for instance, the FBI, and I don't know how many federal officials I talked to, because, on the phone, they would call and ask questions, but I didn't know their names. And if they're phoning you and saying you can do this, you can't do that, then I didn't keep track of who I was talking with, because there would be an FBI from the local city, or the FBI would call from a regional center. And so I wasn't aware of all that, and I didn't know who all of these officials were from the FBI. And so you just become overwhelmed with that, and you also lose track of who you're talking with, and you don't know when you're talking with them as well. So, communication is so critical. And I think it's important that, law enforcement recognize the impact of not only trauma, but also the anger, the anguish, and the pain that family members go through. And I recognize that's not their job, but it has to be addressed, because this isn't the first time this has happened. I mean, I've had other family members who have passed on, and it was a similar situation. But when it was your immediate family member living with you, in this case, my sister Daisy was living with me. So that takes it to a very personal level. Yeah, I just want to speak to that. Communication is so critical. And then also learning to take notes and tracking any information that's being shared with you. And I just want to add also that in the discussions that I've been having with family members, and again, after the fact, after several years, we should have been saving any evidence that we might have had. And then also learning to communicate not only with law enforcement, the county coroner, any investigators that's working on this case, and then also the Bureau of Indian Affairs probate office for guidance as well. There's so many offices that you have to become aware of, and then you also have to be able to understand or at least think about jurisdictions and where she may have been located, because that's another major issue as well. There's all of these issues of jurisdiction that you have to contemplate. And when you first report this, that doesn't come to mind. That isn't the priority. The priority is, praying for the safety, health, and well-being of your sister. You're not thinking about jurisdiction. You're not thinking about, law enforcement and how they're communicating. That's not what's first in your mind right now until much later. And you don't think about the evidence and all of that. So I think simply having a trusted friend, trusted family member to be with you will help to guide and provide support and a spiritual and cultural grounding as well.
There's a lot of great information, Patsy, and I'm very grateful for you sharing that with myself and our audience today. So thank you so much for that. In the 1980s and 1990s, 14 women were murdered or died in mysterious circumstances on the Yakima Reservation, which sprawls across 1.3 million acres of land. After previous attempts in December of 2022, skeletal remains that were found in 2008 were tested for DNA. After decades of searching and not knowing, the remains were identified as that of Daisy Mae. There is so much that's going on when a loved one goes missing. As I understand it, Patsy, you and your family didn't even know if Daisy was missing or murdered all of these years. So what are some key words or phrases that families should listen for when talking with law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a very challenging question because you're going through this. You really don't know what to be thinking or even how to ask the questions. That has been always a challenge all these years, because it's a very, law enforcement is a very specialized office, any law enforcement. And you recognize that with an ongoing case that you're probably not going to receive a lot of information. And I just had wished it wasn't that way, particularly when it involves a loved one. And in this case, my sister. There should be ways that law enforcement can talk to family, on kind of like when we say, government to government basis. It should be that family to family basis, that there should be someone in law enforcement that could be speaking with you at all times and not have to be so technical about it either. And this is one of the reasons we're asking for training and investigative assistance, which is a part of the now Tribal Law and Order Act. It's required, but it's not prioritized in the U.S. Department of Justice. So there are so many critical gaps and life-saving gaps in services and justice. It's imperative that improvements are made at every level of governments, any government. It could be the federal government, city government, tribal government, local governments, on all of these issues that affect our women and our people. When you're dealing with violence or domestic violence, with sexual assault or stalking or LGBTQ2 that we talked about, and just our residents, our housing residents, wherever they may be. So there's so much that needs to be done. And this is one of the reasons, that I advocate for not only my sister, but for others, because in the case of my sister, as I shared, she was a very independent individual and could fend for herself if she had to, and recognizing that about her as families, I just still am compelled as a family member to continue this work, because over the years, we've seen how violence impacts your community and the community of White Swan. Violence has just, in some cases, taken over sometime in our families. And so it's something that's ongoing, and we have to continue to look at the way that our community is, and also begin looking at some of the policies that exist, and work with organizations that can help to improve these services for all of us. But it's going to require us to look at all of these critical gaps that are important in terms of services, the health and welfare and justice for families.
In terms of sticking with law enforcement, are there questions that families should be asking law enforcement, and what should they be looking out for during the first hours of their loved one being missing?
In the case of my sister, where her personal items were found, but this didn't come right away. This came after several years. My sister would talk to law enforcement, but there never was anything there. There was never any communication. So first of all, just communication. So when you talk to law enforcement or the FBI, that's a question to ask, like, what kind of communication is there going to be, if any? And I think it's important for families to know that. What will cause you to communicate with us? We're in a rural community, very remote and isolated. It sometimes feels like your community isn't a priority, and the tribal government is several miles away. I think that's a question to be asked, is how often will we have communication? It's also important to acknowledge the fact that in our case, there were several women that were missing and or murdered. There just wasn't really any communication about the other women. We were very dependent upon the news media to share that information. If we didn't have the news media, then we didn't know really what was going on. And so that's a whole nother issue, is how this is reported and followed up. It wasn't until years later, when we had a community forum in our community of White Swan, several years later, maybe 20 years later, that I learned that about, a serial killer, and tribal officials said that it's more than likely that there was a serial killer involved in this. And that was the first time in some of the cases, and that was the first time I ever heard about the serial killer being a part of this. And so, you around your community, then you begin to think about that, and what's the role of the serial killer. And so there's a lot of questions to be asked. And as families, we're not always prepared for any comments that are made. Shortly after my sister went missing, there was the United States Attorney General who came to our community. I feel like he just came for a visit, and that was it, because he only came to the community, into our public school system where our children were, and just talked very briefly about him wanting to address this issue of missing and murdered. To have a federal official come into your community and say a statement like, we're going to see what we can do about this, there was nothing ever after that. Certainly, there was probably communication with law enforcement, but the families and community didn't know about what law enforcement was going to be doing with the Department of Justice Attorney General's office. And so that, was several years ago during the Bush administration. And so it made the news, of course, but there was nothing that came of it. So, you have that kind of communication, poor communication that's going on. So it's really hard to ask the questions. I mean, how do you ask the questions if there isn't any communication with families and community?
So it sounds light on the side of the law enforcement that they need to be better at communicating. Even if there is no new update, they can
Right.
out and say, we don't have anything new.
Right.
Well, thank you for that information today, Patsy, and thank you for sharing your story with us. We appreciate your time and your energy and your spirit and sharing your story of Daisy Mae with us. If anyone has information regarding the case of Daisy Mae, please contact the FBI at 509-747-5195 or the Yakima Nation Police Department at 509-865-2933. We also want to share the Strong Hearts Native Helpline should you need culturally appropriate advocacy. And that number is 1-844-762-8483. Or you can contact them online by visiting strongheartshelpline.org. This podcast was made possible with funding from the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. Thank you for listening.
Wado, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have time to process what you've learned and share this podcast with others. For everyone listening, please make sure to visit niwrc.org/podcast to view the show notes and links related to the episodes. You can also find the special MMIW edition of Restoration Magazine at niwrc.org/restoration-magazine. I am your host, Leanne Pippin. To everyone out there, thank you so much for listening. Take care.